This lecture is on Chapter 4, Tissues. What are tissues? Tissues are the level of structural organization that consists of groups of cells that are similar in structure and function. Tissues are organized into organs, which makes up the next level of structural hierarchy in the body. There are four major types of tissues: nervous tissue, muscle tissue, epithelial tissue, and connective tissue. In this illustration, you can see that nervous tissue provides internal communication and consists of the brain, spinal cord, and nerves. Muscle tissue contracts to cause movement. Muscles attached to bones are called skeletal muscles. Muscles of the heart are cardiac muscles, and muscles of the walls of hollow organs are called smooth muscles. Epithelial tissue forms boundaries between different environments. It also protects, secretes, absorbs, and filters. Epithelial tissue includes the skin's surface, called the epidermis, as well as the lining of GI tracts, organs, and other hollow organs. Epithelial tissue also forms glands. Connective tissue supports, protects, and binds other tissues together. It includes bones, tendons, fat, and other soft padding tissue. There are different types of epithelial membranes that contain epithelial tissue and an underlying connective tissue. The first is the cutaneous membrane, which makes up the skin. It is composed of stratified squamous epithelium, called the epidermis, attached to a dense irregular connective tissue beneath. This is called the dermis. The cutaneous membrane will be the main topic of the next chapter, the integumentary system. Mucous membranes are wet membranes that line the body cavities which are open to the exterior. These include the digestive and respiratory tracts. Mucous membranes consist of stratified squamous or simple columnar attached to a layer of loose connective tissue beneath, called the lamina propria. In some mucosa, the lamina propria rests on a third, deeper layer of smooth muscle. The mucous membranes provide absorption in the urinary and digestive tracts and secretion in the digestive and respiratory tracts. This picture illustrates a mucous membrane. Notice that it is open to the outside world. Interesting, the airways evolve off of the digestive system during embryonic development. Serous membranes were talked about in Chapter 1. They consist of serosa, which are wet membranes in a closed ventral body cavity. They consist of simple squamous epithelium, called the mesothelium, on top of a layer of loose connective tissue, called areolar connective tissue. The two layers of serous membranes are parietal serosa and visceral serosa. The parietal serosa lines the internal body walls, and the visceral serosa covers the internal organs. This illustration shows the serous membranes of the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity. Recall that in the thoracic cavity, there's the pericardium and the pleura. The pericardium surrounds the heart, the pleura surrounds the lungs. Notice the space between the parietal and visceral serosa. This space is filled with serous fluid. In the abdominal pelvic cavity, the serous membrane is called the peritoneum. And again, notice the space between the parietal and visceral peritoneum. It is also filled with serous fluid. Now let's talk about epithelial tissue. There are several functions of epithelial tissue: protection, absorption, filtration, excretion, secretion, and sensory reception. Protection against abrasion, pathogens, and other elements occurs on the epidermis of the skin. Absorption occurs in hollow organs such as the intestines, where foodstuffs is absorbed via pinocytosis mentioned in the cell chapter. Absorption sends the substance from the digestive tract into the bloodstream. Filtration uses pressure in order to push a substance from a higher pressure to a lower pressure. This is important in capillary exchange as well as glomerular exchange in the kidneys. Excretion includes the excretion of waste products, such as in the skin as sweat, and in the urinary system as urine, and the digestive system as fecal matter. Secretion occurs when a cell has made a substance like a hormone, an antibody, oil, and has secreted it via exocytosis. Sensory reception is the ability of epithelial tissue to connect to the nervous tissue. Since it forms boundaries and linings, it's a direct access point for sensations to go to the nervous system. There are several epithelial tissue characteristics. The epithelial cells have polarity, meaning they have an apical surface and a basal surface. The apical surface is the top of the cell that is exposed to the boundary or lining interior, and the basal surface is the bottom of the cells, which will be attached to the underlying connective tissue. Epithelial cells are closely packed together. They are held together by tight junctions and desmosomes. Recall that tight junctions pinch cells together very tightly, and then desmosomes are part of the cytoskeleton that allow for flexibility between the cells so they don't rip. Epithelial cells are supported by a connective tissue. As I mentioned, the basal surface is attached to the underlying connective tissue. Epithelial cells are avascular but innervated. Avascular means without blood cells, and innervated means that they are connected to nerve tissue. Because of the constant exposure to the environment, epithelial cells have a high rate of regeneration. They undergo mitosis constantly, so they go from that G1 phase into the S phase and then proceeds into mitosis. As a result of the exposure to environmental toxins and UV radiation, abrasion, heat, and the continuous need for mitosis, epithelial cells are at the highest risk for developing cancer. When classifying epithelia, two questions need to be asked. The first question is how many layers are in the epithelium. If there is one layer of cells, it is called a simple epithelium. If there are greater than one layer of cells, it's called a stratified epithelium. This illustration shows a simple epithelium with one layer of cells attached to the underlying connective tissue. The stratified epithelium has more than one layer of cells, with the basal layer connected to the underlying connective tissue. The next question to ask when classifying epithelia is what type of cell? Is it a squamous or flat cell? Is it cuboidal or cube-shaped? Or is it columnar, taller than it is wide? If the tissue is stratified, It is named according to the apical or top layer of cells. A squamous cell is flat, a cuboidal cell is cube-shaped, and a columnar cell is taller than it is wide. Let's look at the different types of epithelial tissues. The simple tissue is going to be functioning in absorption, secretion, and filtration. A pseudostratified appears to be stratified, but it is simple, and it is involved in absorption and secretion. Stratified epithelial tissues are involved in protection and stretch. There are two special locations of the simple squamous epithelia. Simple squamous epithelia will be one layer of flat cells. When they are found in the lining of the lymphatic vessels, the blood vessels, and the heart, they are called the endothelium. When they are found lining the epithelium of serous membranes of the ventral body cavity, they're called mesothelium. You've heard of mesothelium before because you've heard of mesothelioma, which is the cancer of the mesothelium, and it is caused by exposure to environmental toxins such as asbestos. Now we're going to take a look at pictures of the epithelial tissues and revisit some of the names that were just mentioned. And as we look at the epithelia, note the description, function, and location. And this will be useful for your tissues lab. So I won't spend a great deal of time going over all of the information. You'll just know it's there when it's time for you to do your lab. The first picture shows simple squamous epithelium. So this will be one layer of flattened cells. This picture shows simple cuboidal epithelium. So it is one layer of cube-shaped cells. Let me show you how to tell that it is one layer, because you notice that in this picture you're seeing a tube. Looking at this dark pink line, that is the basement membrane connected to the underlying connective tissue. So the basal surface of the cell will be attached to this basement membrane. That is how we know that this is one layer. You can see a perfect cube-shaped cell where my cursor is at this moment. And the apical surface is going to be facing the interior boundary or lumen of the tube. That's where the urine will pass through. And then the basal surface is going to be on the basement membrane attached to the underlying connective tissue. Simple columnar epithelium is one layer of columnar cells that are taller than they are wide. So again, the white part that you see in the middle is a space called the lumen. It's the interior of the digestive tract. The apical surface is going to be facing this interior, whereas the basement membrane has the basal surface of the cell attached to it. And it is like a thick pink band. And you can see that each cell is attached to the basement membrane, and it has the apical surface that is exposed to the interior of the GI tract. So this is one layer. In pseudostratified columnar epithelium, it appears to be layered, but is in fact a simple tissue. And it's named columnar because the cells are taller than they are wide. So someone with really good eyesight could tell that each of these cells is attached to the underlying basement membrane, which is attached to the connective tissue beneath. And so even though the nuclei are at different levels, the cytoplasm extends downward in the plasma membrane of each cell and attaches directly to that basement membrane. One of the defining characteristics of pseudostratified columnar epithelium is the presence of cilia. There is some rare unciliated varieties, but the ones that you'll know about most of the time will have cilia, like in the respiratory tract. The cilia helps to move the mucus out of the cell, and it is also found in the reproductive tract and helps the movement of the eggs down the fallopian tubes. And as you see in this table, the non-ciliated type will be in the male sperm-carrying ducts because the sperm will swim. In stratified squamous epithelium, this truly does have many layers, and there's still a basement layer, and the cells are alive and actively dividing at this layer, and it is attached to a basement membrane attached to the underlying connective tissue. As the cells divide in the basement membrane, they push the older cells towards the surface. And as that occurs, those cells flatten out. That is why it's called stratified squamous epithelium, because the apical cells are flattened. They are squamous. The many layers of a stratified epithelium add protection for the body. The last type of epithelium is the transitional epithelium. It is a stratified epithelium, so the basal layer here attached to the basement membrane underneath attached to the underlying connective tissue is indeed the basal layer. So as it divides, it pushes the older cells upwards toward the apical layer. As the cells get pushed towards the apical layer, they start to take on a different shape. That is where transitional comes from. This shape is going to be wide and rounded so that this tissue can stretch when the bladder, as you can see, is full of urine, or as the urine passes down the ureters. Epithelial tissue can also make glands. And there are two major types of glands. There are endocrine glands and exocrine glands. Endocrine glands are ductless glands which secrete hormones directly into the bloodstream. So there's no tubes that are located in this gland. Basically, the hormones will be secreted by exocytosis directly into the surrounding capillaries. Exocrine glands, however, are going to secrete their products into a duct. And then the secretion will travel through the duct and be released onto body surfaces such as skin or into body cavities. And so exocrine glands are going to be very numerous, more numerous than endocrine glands. You have trillions of them throughout your skin and internal body cavities. And they include mucus glands, sweat glands, oil glands, salivary glands, the digestive glands that secrete enzymes. Now let's talk about connective tissue. Connective tissue is the most abundant and widely distributed tissue type. It has several functions, including connect, protect, insulate, and transport. So connective tissue will bind body organs together. It will bind fleshy organs, such as the respiratory organs and digestive organs, together. It will also bind bony organs to each other via ligaments. It will bind muscles to bones through tendons. It will connect bone to bone through cartilage. Connective tissue protects. Not only does it form the bony framework of the body to protect the vital organs, such as the brain, heart, and lungs, but it also includes the blood, which forms the immune system, which will protect against pathogens. Insulation means that it prevents heat from passing through, and so fatty tissue will insulate the body because it will hold heat inside the body. Heat cannot pass through fatty tissue. It also transports. So blood and lymph are two liquid tissues that will transport nutrients and gases throughout the body, as well as tissue fluid and immune cells. Connective tissue is varied and abundant, as mentioned earlier. The thing that makes them all connected to each other is the fact that they all have a common origin, an embryonic developmental stage called the mesenchyme. They have varying degrees of vascularity. Some connective tissue is highly vascularized and will bleed and heal rapidly. Other types of connective tissue are slightly vascularized, meaning they will not bleed and thus will not heal regularly. Connective tissue also contains cells that are surrounded by a non-living extracellular matrix full of ground substances and fibers. So the ground substance is what determines whether a connective tissue is hard like bone or liquid like blood. And then I mentioned earlier that when the fibers are on the outside of the cell, this was back in the cell chapter, those fibers are collagen. And so we're going to see collagen in the connective tissues. So the collagen are going to be white fibers that are the strongest and most abundant type of connective tissue. They are as strong as steel of the same diameter. Provide high tensile strength and bind all the organs. If you remove the cells of the body, you would still see a connective tissue outline of all the organs because of the collagen network. Elastic fibers are yellow and they are going to be long and thin and they allow for stretch and recoil. Reticular fibers are going to be short, fine, highly branched collagenous fibers, and they form a network that helps to support cells within the tissue. And they are very abundant in spongy organs like the liver and the spleen. The types of cells in connective tissue are going to be of two major types. If they are mitotically active and secreting fibers, they are called blasts. If they are a mature cell, they are called a cyte. So fibroblasts will be common in connective tissue proper and will be secreting a lot of collagen. Chondroblasts will be secreting cartilage, and chondrocytes will be the mature cells of cartilage. Osteoblasts will be secreting bone, and osteocytes are the mature bone cells. Hematopoietic stem cells will form blood in the bone marrow. And then there are fat cells, white blood cells, mast cells, and macrophages. Of course, fat cells will insulate and store energy. White blood cells will protect from pathogens. Mast cells will initiate an inflammatory response. And macrophages will engulf pathogens through phagocytosis. This is an illustration of the fibers and cells that can be found in a connective tissue. You can see the collagen fibers are the thickened white fibers, elastic fibers are yellow, and reticular fibers are netted in blue. Reticular means netted. The macrophage is seen moving around freely. The fibroblast is attached to collagen because it will be secreting the collagen fibers. The lymphocyte, mast cell, and neutrophil are all examples of white blood cells, and the fat cells are pictured in yellow. The major types of connective tissue will be connective tissue proper, structural connective tissue, and fluid connective tissue. So with connective tissue proper, there are two major types, loose and dense. Loose connective tissue will have fibers loosely arranged, and this will be a highly vascularized tissue. It includes areolar, adipose, and reticular. Dense connective tissue will have fibers that are closely packed together and will be poorly vascularized. There will not be a lot of blood flow. And this includes dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic. Now let's take a look at pictures of each of those types of connective tissue. And for your lab that you will do, you will note the description, function, and location. The first is a connective tissue proper, loose connective tissue, and is known as areolar connective tissue. It is a loose network of collagen fibers and has a jelly-like ground substance, and it is located underneath all epithelial tissue in the body. So when mentioning the membranes earlier, there are the cutaneous membranes, mucous membranes, serous membranes, and I noted that a epithelial membrane is composed of epithelial tissue sitting on top of connective tissue. So the connective tissue is going to be areolar, and it's a very thin layer, and it helps to nourish the basal layer of epithelium. Because remember, epithelium is avascular, meaning there's no blood flow to it. So how do these cells get their nourishment? Well, they get it from the underlying areolar connective tissue. With that jelly-like ground substance, it can contain tissue fluid, necessary water, electrolytes, and the nutrients can flow from the bloodstream into the basal membrane and basal layer of the epithelial tissue. The next type of loose connective tissue proper is adipose tissue, and this consists of fat cells that are going to store triglycerides and the fatty acids. The adipose tissue can increase in number and is highly vascularized. When one loses weight, the adipocytes don't die. They just lose their fat stores. So you still have the same amount of fat cells, they're just smaller when you lose weight. The only way to actually rid of those fat cells is to freeze them away, burn them away, or suck them away. The dense connective tissue proper pictured here is called dense regular connective tissue. Notice that the collagen fibers are all running in parallel to each other, and this allows for extension and flexion of a muscle at a joint. So we will see the dense regular connective tissue in tendons, and then we will also see them in ligaments where they are connecting the bones to one another. There is a light bit of stretch allowed to the dense regular connective tissue. However, if overstretched, the tendon or ligaments can become inflamed, which is a sprain, and can even tear. And this is a lightly vascularized tissue, meaning that it is not likely to heal very well. So soft tissue injuries to joints can last a lifetime. The tissue pictured here is dense connective tissue proper, dense irregular. And the collagen fibers are at angles to each other. They are not running parallel. This gives more flexibility to the structure and is helpful in what's called the articular capsule or the fibrous joint capsule. And it allows for movable surface so the joints can move. Notice this pictured here is the shoulder joint, a ball and socket joint that moves in a 360-degree rotation. And also, dense irregular connective tissue is found in the dermis of the skin. This is the connective tissue underneath the epidermis. And it is a thick layer. It has the areolar tissue on top. So we'll look at it in more detail in the next chapter. But the dense irregular connective tissue of the dermis allows for that tough, flexible support. It's the hide. Now let's look at structural connective tissue. There are two major types of structural connective tissue. There's cartilage and bone. There are three major types of cartilage: hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. This picture is of hyaline cartilage, and it has this frosted glass appearance because the collagen fibers are tightly bound together. So this is not a connective tissue proper. We are now in structural connective tissue. And one of the things that happens is the mature cells, pictured here as chondrocytes, they end up trapping themselves in the matrix. And so they form this little cave called a lacuna. And that is where they live out their adult life. And they have a very long lifespan. However, there's not going to be a lot of blood flow in cartilage. And so if the cartilage is damaged, as in a soft tissue injury, it is slow to heal. And the injury can last a lifetime. This is elastic cartilage, and it has elastin fibers scattered throughout the tightly wound collagen fibers, and this allows for more flexibility and is seen in the ears and the epiglottis. And again, the chondrocytes are in their lacuna, and this is not a highly vascularized tissue. The next type of structural tissue is the bony tissue or osseous tissue. The central canal that is pictured in this slide is going to house blood vessels and nerves. And so bony tissue is highly vascularized and innervated and is thus constantly remodeling itself, meaning that it's laying down new bony tissue or absorbing bony tissue into the blood as needed. And if the bone breaks, because it is highly vascularized, it can heal. But there's also a risk for bone infection because the bloody tissue can bring pathogens into the area if exposed. Bones can also succumb to cancers because they are vascularized and highly mitotic. The fluid connective tissues are going to have a matrix that is composed mostly of water. And in blood, that is called plasma. And the cells are going to flow freely throughout the vessels within this plasma. And there are red blood cells and white blood cells. The red blood cells that are pictured here are going to live, as I mentioned, for about 120 days, and they are going to then be regenerated in reticular tissue that hasn't been pictured, but that will be found in the spleen and the liver. And then the white blood cells, as you know, are an important part of the immune system. All blood cells start their lives in the bone marrow of the skeleton. The next tissue type is nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is found in the nervous system, and the organs of the nervous system are the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves. Nervous tissue regulates and controls the body's functions through reception and then control and then going out to the effectors. Do you remember the talk about the homeostatic feedback loop where we had the receptors that detected the change in the stimulus, or the stimulus, which is the change in the variable, and then it sends the information towards the control center, which is generally the brain. And then the brain makes a decision about what to do and then sends it along a motor pathway towards an effector, which would be a muscle or gland. So it goes sensation, control, or integration, and then results with the effectors. So sensory, integration, motor, results with the effectors. And so the neurons are the functional cell of the nervous tissue, and they are what generate and conduct those nerve impulses from sensation to integration or control to motor or effector response. This picture shows the nervous tissue, and the neurons are going to be the orangey brown structure with the obvious yellow nuclei and the long processes coming off of it. These are motor neurons pictured here. All the light color cells around those are called supporting cells or neuroglial cells. They help nourish the neurons, bind them together, and help them grow and form connections. The last type of muscle or last type of tissue is muscle tissue. This is the fourth type. So we've talked about epithelial tissue, connective tissue, nervous tissue, and now muscle tissue. Muscle tissue characteristics are that it is highly vascularized and innervated. So there's a lot of blood flow going to the muscle tissue. It's highly metabolic, and it is going to have the motor response. So motor neurons will be connected to the cells of the muscles. And muscles will produce body movement via the skeletal muscle moving the skeleton, the cardiac muscle moving the heart, and the smooth muscle moving the hollow organs. Skeletal muscle will have long cylindrical cells that will be striated. This is the way that the proteins are laid out. Remember the cytoskeletal elements called actin? I believe those were found in the intermediate, or they were the microfilaments, my bad. The actin, microfilaments. And the actin subunits are going to be shown as the lighter striations. And they're going to be combined with thicker proteins that you'll learn about called myosin. And the actin and myosin will slide over each other in order to form the process of contraction. And that is the movement of the muscle. You'll also notice that there are many nuclei. All these proteins are going to have to be replenished if they get damaged. And so there's a lot of DNA that is necessary for this process to occur. So a lot of protein synthesis going on here. So you'll see lots of nuclei in these long cylindrical striated cells. There's also going to be a lot of ATP involved. So you better believe there'll be a lot of mitochondria throughout this tissue. Cardiac muscle is also striated, so the actin and the myosin will be overlapping just like in the skeletal muscle. However, the cardiac muscle is going to be a lot shorter and they will be branching. And you notice these dark bands called intercalated discs. These are gap junctions that connect the adjacent cells to one another and provide for ion flow between the cells, because you know that the heart is going to pump as a unit. And so ions such as sodium and potassium and calcium have to flow freely from cell to cell in order for that unison to occur. Another thing you'll notice about cardiac muscle is there aren't as many nuclei. It's not a multinucleated cell because the cells themselves will be smaller. So there's one nucleus per cell, maybe two at most. Smooth muscle lacks striations, which is why it's called smooth muscle. There's still actin and myosin, but they're not in the shape that they are in the cardiac and the muscle cells. They're not overlapping. They're in more of like a net called calveoli, and we'll learn about that later. But when they contract, they kind of pull the muscles taut. And so these muscles will elongate and shorten and are generally going to be layered in the muscles in which they control. You'll have longitudinal smooth muscle, you'll have circular smooth muscle, and sometimes you'll even have oblique smooth muscle, so that the churning and movement is going to propel substances through this hollow organs. And as you can see, the GI tract is illustrated here, and other smooth muscle locations will be in blood vessels. Tissues can be damaged, and when that occurs, they need to repair themselves. And if they can't repair themselves, then as I mentioned, the injury will be lifelong. But there are many tissues that can repair, particularly the epidermis of the skin. And so when the epidermis is injured, the first step is inflammation. And this is the release of inflammatory chemicals. The epidermis is not the only tissue type that undergoes inflammation. So you know that your heart, the endothelium can be inflamed, mesothelium can be inflamed, the interior of the GI tract can be inflamed. So I was just using the epidermis as an example, but I digress. Inflammation is the first step in tissue repair. It is the release of inflammatory chemicals. The reason this is important is because it causes the dilation of blood vessels, it increases vessel permeability, and then it brings in clotting factors so that clotting can occur. So inflammation is necessary for tissue repair to begin. If it is acute inflammation, then it will heal. If it is chronic inflammation, then that means that healing has never occurred, and chronic inflammation can lead to disease. In this illustration, it shows inflammation setting the stage. So severed blood vessels will bleed and inflammatory chemicals released from mast cells in particular. Local blood vessels will become more permeable as a result. This allows white blood cells, like the neutrophils pictured, to move from the capillaries into the tissue. It will also bring fluid into the area, which is where the swelling occurs. It will bring clotting proteins and other plasma proteins into the injured area. Then clotting will occur. The surface will dry and it will form a scab. So as you know, the inflammation will have redness because of the dilated blood vessels, swelling because of the incoming tissue fluid, heat radiating from the dilated blood vessels, and pain from the pressure on the nervous system. The next step in tissue repair is the organization and restored blood supply. This is characterized by granulation tissue. Granulation tissue is going to be where the blood vessels are regrowing and the epithelium will begin to regenerate. Sometimes granulation tissues can form cysts, like a granulated cyst that has blood flow to it. Another thing happening here is fibroblasts will be producing collagen fibers that will help bridge the gap between the torn tissues, and then debris will be phagocytized by the white blood cells. So this illustration shows the granulation tissue in the organization phase. So the clot will be replaced by granulation tissue, restoring the vascular supply. Fibroblasts will produce collagen fibers, bridging the gap between the ends that were severed. Macrophages will phagocytize cell debris, and surface epithelial cells multiply and migrate over the granulation tissue. So epithelium can actually regenerate, and that's part of the next stage. If the tissue can actually regenerate and restore its proper function, then the regeneration has occurred. Otherwise, a scar will form. So the underlying dermis tends to scar. And the thicker the scar, the more obvious it is, and that is called a secondary union. And the thinner the scar, the less obvious it is because a primary union has been formed. What determines the unions is the degree in which the skin was severed and distance from the parts. And so if the distance was narrow, that's a primary union and it's a light scar. If the distance was great, it's a secondary union and is a larger scar. Sometimes the distance can be far enough that sutures are needed in order to bring the severed ends back together. So here in this illustration, we see that the fibrosed area matures and contracts, and the epithelium will thicken and regenerate, and the scar will be in the dermis underneath. So looking at the skin, the epithelium is going to be indicated by this lower layer of purple cube-shaped cells, but this is a stratified squamous epithelium because the upper layers are flattened. So that's the epidermis there that can fully regenerate. And then all of this from the purple line down to the yellow line is the dermis. And just underneath that purple line will be where the areolar connective tissue is. That's the top layer of the dermis. And then 80% of the dermis is the dense irregular connective tissue. Thus, it's called the reticular layer. As tissues age, they lose the ability to maintain homeostasis. Cells lose their ability to synthesize collagen and keratin. Keratin is a type of cytoskeletal element within the cells that help to toughen the cells and waterproof them. It is found in the epidermis, and it was part of the desmosomes as well in the cellular junctions. So cells lose their ability to synthesize both collagen, so fibroblasts are not synthesizing collagen as well, and your epidermal cells are not synthesizing keratin. So the tissues will ultimately break down and thin. Many tissues will lose mass through a process called atrophy. Diet, exercise, genetics, and healthy habits can maintain tissue health as the body ages. Here's a diagram that shows the important components for healthy aging. We can see that diet, genes, and exercise are included, as is productive pursuits and goal setting and social activity. And that is the end of Chapter 4, Tissues. Thanks for listening.